My daughter-in-law called me a distraction right before the baptism. She invited the whole town, but banned the 58-year-old grandmother because she thought I would ruin the aesthetic. She did not realize that by locking me out, she had handed me the key to destroy the perfect life she pretended to have. When I pushed open those church doors, I was not looking for forgiveness. I was looking for the truth that would bury her. My name is Evelyn Hart. I am 58 years old, and for the better part of 3 decades, I worked as a case manager at Ridgeway Community Services. I have spent a lifetime sitting across from people whose lives were falling apart, listening to the fracture of families and the quiet devastation of abandonment. I thought I had built a thick skin. I thought I knew how to handle being discarded because I had seen it happen to so many others. I was wrong. The notification on my phone screen was bright and innocent, a simple ping that shattered the quiet of my Saturday morning. It was a message from a woman named Linda, a former neighbor who moved to the other side of town 2 years ago. She had forwarded me a digital invitation, the kind with scrolling gold calligraphy that people pay too much money for. It was for a baptism. The baptism of my grandson, Leo. I stared at the screen, my reading glasses sliding down my nose. The ceremony was today, in 2 hours. The location was the First Methodist Church on Oak Street, the same church where I had buried my husband 20 years ago. I scrolled through the guest list attached to the link. It seemed endless. There were cousins I had not seen in a decade. There were Marcus's co-workers. There were people from Marissa's yoga class. It seemed the entire population of our town had been summoned to witness the holy sacrament of my grandson's life. Everyone, except the woman whose blood ran in his veins. My son, Marcus Hart, had said nothing. He is 34 years old now, a man with broad shoulders and a beard that makes him look like a stranger. But I still remember the weight of him in my arms. He had not called. He had not sent a card. He had simply erased me. I knew who held the eraser. Marissa Caldwell Hart. My daughter-in-law had made her feelings clear from the moment she realized my pension would not buy her a vacation home. She treated our relationship like a transaction that had failed to yield a profit. But it was the second screenshot from Linda that stopped my heart. It was a snippet of a group chat where someone had asked, innocent as could be, if Marcus's mother would be attending. Marissa's reply was sharp enough to cut glass. I do not want her there. Evelyn just makes things messy. She is a distraction. The word distraction hung in the air of my living room. It was worse than being called hated or unwanted. A distraction is something trivial. A distraction is a fly buzzing against a window pane while important people try to have a conversation. It implied that my love, my history, and my very existence were nothing more than unnecessary noise in her curated life. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the ghost of the grief I felt when Marcus first stopped coming by for Sunday dinner. But beneath the grief, something else was waking up. It was a cold, hard resolve. I was not going to the church to scream. I was not going to demand they let me hold the baby. I just wanted to see. I wanted to look at my son and see if he could meet my eyes while his wife treated his mother like a mistake to be hidden away. I stood up, my joints protesting, and walked to the hallway. My landline rang. I almost ignored it, but habit made me pick it up. There was no greeting, just a voice, low and hurried, a voice I almost recognized but could not place. Mrs. Hart, please do not come down here, the person whispered. It is not safe for you today. Just stay away. The line went dead before I could ask why. That was the moment the sadness evaporated. Safe. Why would a baptism be unsafe for a grandmother? The atmosphere shifted. This was not just a family squabble anymore. There was a rot here, a secret festering underneath the white lace and holy water. I walked to the mirror by the door. I looked at the woman reflected there. I saw the lines of age, yes, but I also saw the woman who had raised a boy alone, the woman who had fought for vulnerable children for 30 years. I buttoned my navy coat, the one with the slightly worn collar. I smoothed it down with hands that did not tremble. They called me a distraction. They had no idea what kind of storm was about to walk through their door. The silence in my car was heavy, but it was nothing compared to the silence that had filled my home for the last 5 years. As I turned onto the main road, my mind drifted back to a time when my life was loud, messy, and full of love. I thought of Marcus when he was 7 years old. He was such a gentle soul back then, the kind of boy who would cry if he accidentally stepped on a snail. I used to take him with me to the community center on weekends. He would stand on a crate to reach the counter, helping me ladle soup for the homeless. His small face serious and determined. He loved being my helper. He loved me. That boy would wrap his arms around my waist and tell me I was his best friend. That bond was forged in the fire of survival. After my husband died in a car accident on the interstate, I was left with a mortgage I could barely afford, a grieving child, and my mother, whose arthritis had turned her hands into painful, twisted claws. I did not have the luxury of falling apart. I worked 2 shifts a day for nearly a decade. I would come home from the social services office, cook dinner for Marcus and my mother, help with homework, bathe my mother, and then head out to clean offices until 2 in the morning. I wore my exhaustion like a second skin, but I never complained because every sacrifice was for him. I wanted Marcus to have a future where he did not have to scrape for every dime. I succeeded. Perhaps too well. Marcus went to college, got a degree in finance, and then he met Marissa. She was stunning. I will give her that. But she had eyes that assessed the value of everything they touched. From the moment she entered his life, I felt the temperature drop. She was ambitious in a way that felt predatory. Slowly, she began to prune his life of anything she deemed unnecessary, and I was at the top of that list. It started with the finances. Marissa took over his accounts, claiming she was better at managing their portfolio. Then she took over his schedule, then his opinions. I watched my son shrink. The calls became infrequent. When I did manage to get him on the phone, his voice was tight, rehearsed. He would say that Marissa did not like him spending too much time with me because they needed to focus on their nuclear family. It was a script she had written for him, and he recited it perfectly. The memory that hurts the most, the one that played on a loop in my mind as I drove toward the church, was the engagement dinner 3 years ago. It was a potluck-style gathering at their new house. I had spent all afternoon baking my signature shepherd's pie, a dish Marcus had adored growing up. When I arrived, Marissa looked at the casserole dish in my hands with undisguised disgust. She told me loudly, in front of her wealthy friends, that my comfort food was greasy and did not fit the elegant theme she had curated. She made me leave it in the kitchen, hidden away, while she served catered hors d'oeuvres. I stood in the corner, holding a glass of water, wondering what I had done to deserve such disdain. Was I truly so terrible, or was I simply a reminder of a past she wanted to erase? I had spent so many nights sitting in my armchair, staring at the phone, willing it to ring. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollowness in my chest where my family used to be. I questioned every parenting decision I had ever made. I wondered if I had loved him too much or not enough. But today, the sadness was giving way to a cold realization. I was not the problem. I was simply the obstacle in her total conquest of his life. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping me out of my reverie. I glanced down at the screen. It was a text message from a blocked number. The preview flashed on the screen, short and chilling. "There is something at the church you need to know." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Someone else knew. Someone else saw the cracks in the porcelain facade Marissa had built. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator. I was done being the sad, lonely widow in the corner. I was coming for the truth. The drive to the First Methodist Church felt less like a commute and more like a funeral procession of one. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, mirroring the pale sky hanging over the town. Every mile marker I passed was a question mark. Was I making a mistake? Was I truly the villain in their story? The overbearing mother who could not let go, I debated turning the car around a dozen times. I did not want to be the woman who ruined a holy ceremony. I did not want to be the scene everyone whispered about at brunch the next day. But the alternative was worse. To turn back was to accept that I no longer existed in my son's life. To turn back was to agree that I was nothing more than a distraction to be managed and discarded. I could not do that. I had survived too much to be erased without a sound. I needed strength. So I did something I had not done in a long time. I tapped the screen of my phone and scrolled back through years of digital silence until I found it. It was a saved voicemail from 10 years ago. I pressed play. The sound of Marcus's voice filled the small cabin of my sedan, young and bright and unburdened by the weight he carried now. "Hey, Mom. Just calling to see how you're doing. I love you. Call me back when you get this. I love you." The words hung in the air, a ghost haunting the dashboard. That boy sounded so free. That boy was not afraid of his wife. That boy was not hiding from his mother. I let the recording play twice, letting the memory of his affection armor me against what was coming. I wiped a single tear from my cheek, set my jaw, and turned the final corner. The sight that greeted me was a physical blow. The church parking lot was not just full, it was overflowing. Vehicles were parked on the grass verges and spilling out onto the street. There were luxury SUVs, polished sedans, and trucks belonging to people I had known for decades. The sheer volume of cars confirmed the cruel reality I had tried to deny. This was not a small, private affair. This was a community event. Everyone was here. My neighbours, my former colleagues, the people who bought cookies from me at bake sales. They had all been invited to celebrate my grandson, and I was the only one left standing on the outside. I found a spot 2 blocks away and walked back. The autumn wind bit through my coat, but I barely felt it. As I neared the entrance, I saw Mrs. Higgins, a woman who had lived 3 doors down from me for 15 years. She was hurrying toward the steps, adjusting her hat. She looked up, saw me, and her face went slack. Instead of waving, she immediately looked down at the pavement and quickened her pace, pretending she had not seen me at all. Marissa had done her work well. She had not just uninvited me, she had painted me as a pariah. I placed my foot on the first concrete step. The heavy wooden doors of the church were propped open, and the sound of the organ spilled out. As I ascended, the chatter in the vestibule died down. It happened in waves, a ripple of silence spreading as people noticed my arrival. I heard the whispers. They were sharp and distinct. "She is here." I thought Marissa said she was not coming. Look at her. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating. It did not feel like a celebration. It felt like a courtroom just before a verdict is read. Children were running around the legs of their parents, oblivious and happy. But the adults were stiff. They turned their backs to me, examining the notice boards or checking their watches. Anything to avoid making eye contact with the woman who was not supposed to be there. They looked like they were complicit in a crime they did not want to witness. I stepped through the threshold and into the sanctuary. The nave was packed. At the far end, near the altar, Reverend Miller was adjusting his robes. He looked up, scanned the crowd, and his eyes landed on me. He physically flinched. He looked like he had seen a ghost. A man of God should not look that terrified to see a grandmother at a baptism. Then, at the front of the church, in the first pew, a head turned. It was Marcus. He must have felt the shift in the room, the sudden heaviness in the air. He looked over his shoulder and locked eyes with me. I braced myself for anger. I expected him to scowl, to stand up and demand I leave, to defend his wife's wishes. But there was no anger in his face. His face was pale, drained of blood. His eyes were wide and trembling. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated fear. He did not look like a man annoyed by a distraction. He looked like a man who was terrified of what was about to happen to me. Marissa moved before I could take another step. She cut through the aisle with the precision of a heat-seeking missile, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. She did not look like a worried mother or a welcoming hostess. She looked like a security guard intercepting a threat. She stopped right in front of me, blocking my view of Marcus, effectively placing herself as a physical barrier between mother and son. She leaned in close, bringing with her a cloud of expensive perfume that smelled of jasmine and cold ambition. She did not bother with pleasantries. She hissed the words through a smile that did not reach her eyes. She said that she had told me explicitly not to come here. She said that I was embarrassing her. Her voice was low, a razor-sharp whisper intended for my ears only, but the acoustics of the old church betrayed her. The vaulted ceilings, designed to carry the voice of the preacher to the back rows, carried her venom just as effectively. The murmuring in the pews died instantly. I looked around and saw the shocked faces of the people in the nearest rows. They had heard her. They had heard a daughter-in-law tell a grandmother that her presence was an embarrassment. Marcus stood up in the front pew. He looked pale, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked at me, then at the back of his wife's head. He opened his mouth as if to defend me, or perhaps to call out to me. But Marissa reached back without looking at him. She grabbed his hand. It was not a hold of comfort. I saw her knuckles turn white. She was squeezing his hand hard enough to hurt, a physical warning to stay silent. Marcus winced, and the fight drained out of him. He slumped slightly, his eyes dropping to the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with judgment. Then, a voice broke it. It was not my voice. It came from the third row on the bride's side. An elderly woman stood up, leaning heavily on a cane. I recognized her as Mrs. Gable, a wealthy matriarch who had been friends with the Caldwell family for 40 years. She was the kind of woman whose opinion mattered in this town. She adjusted her glasses and spoke with a volume that required no microphone. She asked why the groom's mother had not been invited. The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. All eyes shifted from me to the couple at the altar. There was no way to hide now. Marissa turned to face the congregation, her smile twitching at the corners. She opened her mouth, likely to spin a lie about me being ill or confused, but the weight of the stares was too much. She faltered. She looked at Marcus, expecting him to cover for her, to recite the lines she had likely fed him. But Marcus could not do it. He stood there, stammering, his face flushing a deep, shameful red. He looked like a child caught stealing, unable to form a coherent sentence. His silence was louder than any confession. The tension in the room was palpable. It was no longer a celebration of life. It was a public unraveling. While the crowd murmured, debating the scene they were witnessing, a man in a dark suit approached me from the side. He was one of the church aides, a man I had known for years, named Mr. Thompson. He did not look at Marissa. He leaned in close to my shoulder. He whispered that there was something I needed to see after the service. He said it was about Marcus. His tone was grave, suggesting that the public humiliation I just faced was only the tip of the iceberg. Reverend Miller cleared his throat at the altar, looking uncomfortable. He sensed that the sanctity of the moment had been shattered. He announced that there would be a brief recess before the ceremony commenced, citing a technical difficulty, though everyone knew the difficulty was entirely human. The spell was broken. The guests began to talk all at once, a cacophony of gossip and speculation. Marissa did not waste a second. She turned on her heel, gripping Marcus by the elbow with a force that looked painful. She began dragging him toward the vestry, the private room behind the altar. She walked with her head high, pretending to be in control, but I saw the panic in her stiff posture. Marcus stumbled after her, looking back at me one last time with that same terrified expression. I stood alone in the center of the aisle, surrounded by 500 strangers, watching my son disappear behind a heavy oak door. The storm had not just arrived, it was about to tear the roof off. The chaos of the sanctuary faded into a dull roar as I followed Mr. Thompson down a narrow hallway lined with portraits of past deacons. He did not speak until we reached the church records room, a small, windowless space that smelled of lemon polish and old paper. He closed the door, locking out the whispers of the congregation. Without a word, he reached behind a stack of hymnals and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He told me that someone had slid it under the office door late last night. He said he did not know who sent it, but after glancing at the first page, he knew it was not something that belonged in the trash. I took the envelope. My hands were steady, but my stomach turned. I pulled out a stack of papers that were definitely not religious texts. They were bank statements, loan agreements, and incorporation documents. I began to read, and with every page, the air in the room seemed to get thinner. The first document was a loan agreement for a business venture called Caldwell Consulting. The principal amount was staggering. It was for $250,000. The signature at the bottom, shaky but unmistakable, belonged to Marcus Hart. But as I flipped to the transaction history, the pattern became clear and terrifying. The money had not gone into business development or office space. It had been siphoned out in a series of cash withdrawals and transfers to a private account solely in Marissa's name. Marcus was the legal guarantor. He was the one on the hook for $250,000, while she held the debit card. I turned the page to see the credit card statements. The numbers were nauseating. There were charges for designer boutiques in the city, spa weekends that cost $3,000 a pop, and jewelry purchases that rivaled the cost of my car. I did the math in my head. Marissa was spending nearly 5 times what Marcus earned in a month. There was no way they were paying this off. They were drowning, and Marcus was the one tied to the anchor. Then I found the email. It was a printout of a correspondence between Marissa and a lawyer whose name I did not recognize. The subject line was simply, "Bankruptcy Strategy." My eyes scanned the text, and my blood ran cold. Marissa had written that they needed to keep Evelyn away at all costs. She wrote that once they finished the strategic bankruptcy and liquidated the assets, I would be nothing but a financial drain. She explicitly stated that I would be a burden on the state, not on them. So there was no point in maintaining a relationship. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was not just a case of a daughter-in-law who found me annoying. This was a calculated financial crime. Marissa was not just controlling Marcus. She was setting him up. She was building a mountain of debt in his name, hoarding the cash for herself, and planning to crash his credit score into the ground to wipe the slate clean. Marcus was not keeping me away because he stopped loving me. He was keeping me away because he was being held hostage. He was likely being blackmailed, threatened, or manipulated into believing this was the only way to save his family. At the bottom of the stack was the registration form for today's ceremony. In the section for security notes, written in Marissa's sharp, angular handwriting, was a single instruction. Evelyn Hart is a security risk. Do not admit under any circumstances. I dropped the papers onto the desk. I felt tears prick my eyes, but they were not tears of self-pity. I was done feeling sorry for myself. These were tears of pure terror for my son. He was trapped in a web of lies so thick he probably could not see a way out. He was not the villain of this story. He was the victim. He was a man being psychologically disassembled by the woman who promised to love him. I wiped my face. I was not a distraction. I was the only person in that building who could save him, and I had the evidence right here in my hands. I stepped out of the records room, clutching the envelope to my chest like a shield. I had not taken more than 3 steps down the corridor before a hand clamped around my upper arm. It was Marissa. She did not look like the poised socialite anymore. Her face was flushed, her hair was slightly disheveled, and her grip was strong enough to bruise. She yanked me into a narrow alcove near the side exit, away from the main crowd, but still within earshot of the lingering guests. She did not bother with pleasantries. She leaned in, her eyes wide and manic. She told me that if I said a single word to Marcus about whatever trash I had found, she would make sure he lost custody of Leo. She promised me that she would paint him as unstable and unfit in every court in the state. She hissed that I would never see my grandson, and Marcus would spend the rest of his life paying child support for a child he was not allowed to visit. I stared at her, chillingly calm. I finally understood the full scope of her cruelty. She was not just protecting a financial scam. She was using an innocent baby as a hostage to keep her husband in line. It was monstrous. But Marissa had made a fatal error. She was so focused on silencing me that she had not checked her blind spot. I looked over her shoulder. Marcus was standing 10 feet away, frozen in the shadow of a pillar. He had come looking for his wife, likely to apologize again. But instead, he had walked right into the truth. His face was a mask of absolute horror. He had heard every word. He had heard the woman he married threaten to take his son away as a bargaining chip. Marissa saw my gaze shift and spun around. The colour drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. She started to stammer, reaching out a hand toward him. But Marcus took a step back. He looked at her as if she were a venomous snake coiled to strike. I did not give her a chance to recover. I walked past her and pressed the manila envelope into Marcus's hands. I told him to look at the papers. I told him to see exactly what his sacrifice had bought him. Marcus opened the envelope. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the stack. He began to read. I watched his eyes scan the loan documents, the fake business registration, and the credit card statements. I saw the moment the reality hit him. He stopped breathing for a second. He flipped to the email, the one where she called him a tool for her bankruptcy fraud. A strangled sound escaped his throat, a sound of pure, agonizing betrayal. Marissa lunged for the papers. She shrieked that I had forged them. She screamed that I was a liar and a saboteur who had printed fake documents to ruin their marriage. She tried to snatch the sheets from his hands, tearing the edge of a bank statement in the process. The commotion drew a crowd. The guests who had been whispering in the lobby moved closer, forming a tight circle around us. They saw the desperation in Marissa's eyes. They saw the tears streaming down Marcus's face. A man in a grey suit, one of Marcus's college friends, stepped forward and told Marissa to back off. He said that if the papers were fake, she had nothing to worry about, so she should let him read. Marcus looked up from the documents. The fear I had seen earlier was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting devastation. He looked at Marissa, really looked at her, and it was as if he was seeing a stranger wearing his wife's face. He held up the paper where she had signed his name to a loan he knew nothing about. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the hallway, it carried the weight of a death sentence. He asked her what she had done to his family. He asked her how she could turn their life into a crime scene. Marissa opened her mouth to argue, but for the first time in 5 years, her words had no power. The truth was out, and it was ugly, undeniable, and loud. The rumors moved faster than the Holy Spirit through the congregation. Within seconds, the whisper that started in the hallway had infected the entire sanctuary. People were leaning over pewbacks, passing the information along like a darker version of the peace offering. The sentence was simple, but devastating. Marissa was using Marcus as a scapegoat to hide a massive debt. The solemnity of the baptism was gone, replaced by the electric, hungry energy of a public scandal. I watched as smartphones appeared from pockets and purses. I saw the red recording lights blinking like unblinking eyes. They were not filming the baby anymore. They were filming the destruction of a marriage. Reverend Miller tried to regain control. He stepped up to the pulpit and tapped the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers, asking for order and respect for the house of God. But nobody was listening to the sermon. The congregation had become a jury, and they were hungry for a verdict. A man in the third row stood up. I recognized him immediately. It was David, a senior loan officer at the First National Bank who had been invited because he was a donor to the church. He did not look at the altar. He looked straight at the papers trembling in Marcus's hand. He spoke loud enough for the back row to hear. He said that he had seen Marissa come into his branch 3 days ago. He said she had tried to withdraw $10,000 in cash from a joint account, but she did not have the second signature required. He said she had made a scene then, too. That confirmation acted like gasoline on a fire. The murmurs turned into shouts. An elderly woman near the font, Mrs. Abernathy, pointed a shaking finger at Marissa. She yelled that she had heard Marissa at the grocery store just last week calling Evelyn a pathetic old hag who deserved to die alone. The facade of the perfect, misunderstood daughter-in-law evaporated instantly. Marissa looked around, her eyes darting from face to face, realizing she had lost the room. Panic set in, stripping away her composure. She started to shout denials, but her voice was shrill and unconvincing. She claimed the banker was lying. She claimed Mrs. Abernathy was senile. But every time she opened her mouth, she dug the hole deeper. She said she only took the money to protect it from Marcus, accidentally admitting that she had indeed taken the money. The crowd turned on Marcus. It was not malicious, but it was intense. People were shouting questions at him, demanding to know if he knew he was being used. They asked if he had signed those papers willingly. They asked how he could let this happen. Marcus looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. He turned in circles, looking at the faces of his friends and neighbors, unable to speak. The pressure was crushing him. Then, a tall man in a charcoal suit pushed through the crowd. It was Mr. Sterling, a family lawyer who had known Marcus since he was a boy. He stepped into the circle, placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, and spoke with the authority of a judge. He told Marcus to step away from her right now. He said that for his own legal safety and the safety of his assets, he needed to physically separate himself from Marissa immediately. That was the breaking point for Marissa. She lunged toward Marcus, grabbing at his lapels, her face twisted into a mask of pure ugliness. She screamed right in his face. She called him stupid. She called him a spineless coward who could not do anything without holding his mommy's hand. She shrieked that he was nothing without her management. The insult echoed off the high stone walls. It was the kind of verbal abuse that usually happens behind closed doors, but now it was out in the open for 500 people to see. Marcus stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then, something in his eyes changed. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He looked at the woman who had just called him a coward. He looked at the baby carrier sitting on the pew. Then he looked at me. Marcus reached up and peeled Marissa's fingers off his jacket one by one. He pushed her away, not violently, but with a finality that was terrifying. He turned his back on her. He walked through the circle of people, past the lawyer, past the banker, and came to stand right next to me. He did not say a word. He just stood there, shoulder to shoulder with his mother, facing the woman who had tried to destroy us both. The line had been drawn, and for the first time in 5 years, my son was on the right side of it. The silence that fell over the church was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually follows a gunshot. Marcus stood next to me, his shoulders slumped, the adrenaline of his defiance draining away to reveal a jagged, raw devastation. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes brimming with tears that he was no longer trying to hide. He spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, yet in the quiet sanctuary, it carried like a shout. He confessed that he had not held his own debit card in 3 years. He told me that Marissa kept them locked in a safe I had never seen. He admitted that every time he asked to see a statement, she told him he was being abusive and controlling. He took a shuddering breath and continued. He said she had threatened him. She had told him that if he did not follow her rules, if he did not cut me out, she would take the baby and move across the country where he would never find them. He looked at me with a pleading expression that broke my heart. He said he pushed me away because he thought if he just gave her what she wanted, if he just made himself smaller, She would finally be happy, and they could be a family. I felt a tear slide down my own cheek, but I did not wipe it away. I looked at my son, a man who had been hollowed out by manipulation, and I knew I had to say something that would shatter the last of his delusions. I reached out and took his hand. I spoke clearly, my voice steady and strong. I told him that happiness is never built on fear. The words hung in the air, resonating with a truth that everyone in the room recognized. Marissa stood near the altar, her face twisting with rage, opening her mouth to scream another insult. But before she could speak, a heavy voice boomed from the back of the church. A man in a dark suit stepped out from the last pew. I knew him. It was Detective Miller, a man who had been a deacon at this church for 20 years. He was not in uniform, but he carried the authority of the law in every step he took down the center aisle. He did not look at Marcus. He looked straight at Marissa. He announced that it was very interesting to hear about these financial disputes because his department had opened a file on her 2 months ago. He said that there were flags on her accounts for wire fraud and identity theft involving 3 other elderly people in the county. The color did not just drain from Marissa's face, it vanished. She stumbled back, hitting the communion rail. The congregation gasped as one. The puzzle pieces were slamming into place. She was not just a bad wife. She was a predator. Then, another voice rang out. A woman near the choir stand stood up. I recognized her as a social worker from the agency where Marissa had briefly worked as an administrator. She pointed a finger at my daughter-in-law. She shouted that she remembered Marissa. She said Marissa was fired for emotional abuse of the staff and falsifying timesheets. She said she had never seen someone so skilled at gaslighting people into thinking they were crazy. The wall of lies crumbled completely. Marcus let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire life for the last half-decade had been a performance directed by a criminal. He sat down heavily on the pew, burying his face in his hands. He shook uncontrollably. He realized that the woman he shared a bed with, the woman he had terrified his mother to please, had never loved him. She had just been using him as a line of credit. I sat down beside him. I did not scold him. I did not ask why he had not told me sooner. I simply placed my hand on his heaving back and rubbed circles between his shoulder blades, just like I did when he was a boy with a scraped knee. I was his anchor in the storm. Marissa looked around the room. She saw the detective closing in. She saw the judgment in 500 pairs of eyes. She saw her husband being comforted by the enemy she had tried to destroy. The mask fell away completely, revealing nothing but panic. She bolted. She kicked off her heels and ran toward the side exit, pushing a flower arrangement to the floor with a crash. Detective Miller did not run. He simply quickened his pace, signaling to 2 uniformed officers who had been waiting in the vestibule. He called out to her, his voice calm and commanding. He told her that running would only make it worse and invited her to come down to the station to answer some questions. As the heavy doors swung shut behind her fleeing figure, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, piercing the sanctity of the morning. The adrenaline that had fueled the confrontation evaporated, leaving behind a wreckage that felt more like a battlefield than a baptism. Marcus sat huddled on the pew, his head buried in his hands, looking less like a 34-year-old man and more like the frightened child who used to hide behind my legs during thunderstorms. The church was buzzing with low conversation, but around us, there was a bubble of heavy silence. Marcus finally looked up. His eyes were red and swollen. He told me that he had felt like he was drowning for years. He confessed that he walked on eggshells every single day, terrified that one wrong move would detonate his life. He admitted that he knew, deep down, that isolating me was wrong. But he was too weak to fight her constant barrage of manipulation. He said he was a coward. He said he had let her strip him of his spine because it was easier than fighting a war in his own living room. I wanted to wrap him in my arms and tell him it was not his fault. But that would have been a lie. I was his mother, but I was not his enabler. I looked him in the eye and told him that I loved him, but I would not accept his pity. I told him that while Marissa was the predator, he had been the one to open the door and let her in. I told him that his silence was a choice he made every single day for 5 years. I told him that he had allowed fear to dictate his loyalty. It was harsh, but it was the truth he needed to hear to survive. His face crumbled. He reached out and grabbed my hand, his grip desperate. He begged me not to leave him. He pleaded with me to stay. I looked at him, feeling the weight of the years I had spent alone, staring at a silent phone. I squeezed his hand back, gentle but firm. I told him that I had never left him. I told him that he was the one who had left me. He broke down then, really broke down, and pulled me into an embrace that knocked the wind out of me. It was not the hug of a child seeking comfort. It was the embrace of 2 survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage. I held him, smelling the familiar scent of his soap beneath the sweat of fear, and I felt the first brick of the wall between us come down. It was not total forgiveness. The wounds were too deep for that to happen in an hour, but it was a start. It was the beginning of healing. Detective Miller walked back down the aisle a few minutes later. He stopped by our pew and confirmed the news. Marissa was being held for questioning. He said it looked like a massive scheme involving multiple counts of credit fraud and embezzlement. He said she would not be coming back anytime soon. As we stood up to leave, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. The same people who had shunned me an hour ago began to approach. Mrs. Higgins, the neighbor who had ignored me in the parking lot, walked up with tears in her eyes. She took my hand and apologized. She said she should have known better than to believe the gossip. She said she was ashamed. One by one, they came, offering awkward murmurs of regret. But it was the younger guests who surprised me. A group of young women, friends of Marcus from college, came up to me. They did not apologize. They looked at me with something like awe. One of them told me that she hoped she would have half my strength when she was my age. She called me a symbol of resilience. She said watching me stand up to a bully was the most inspiring thing she had seen in years. We walked out of the church into the bright afternoon sun. Marcus carried Leo in the car seat, holding him close to his chest. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at me. He did not ask me to fix it. He did not ask for money. He asked me if I would help him learn how to stand on his own 2 feet again. He asked for a chance to be the son I deserved, not the one he had been forced to be. I looked at him and nodded. We had a long road ahead, but for the first time in a long time, we were walking on the same path. The legal wheels turned slowly, but they ground Marissa down to dust. Her arrest was not the glamorous exit she probably imagined for herself. There were no cameras, just the cold, hard click of handcuffs and a list of charges that read like a manual on how to destroy a life. She was indicted on 7 counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and thanks to the testimony of the social worker domestic abuse. The state did not go easy on her. She had preyed on the elderly, and she had preyed on her husband. and the court system took that very personally. Marcus did not crumble. For the first time in his life, he stood tall in the wreckage. He filed for temporary sole custody of Leo immediately, and he cooperated fully with the investigation. He handed over every password, every bank statement, and every email. He stopped protecting the woman who had sold him out and started protecting the son who needed him. 2 weeks after the disaster at the church, I sat in a lawyer's office and signed the papers that granted me legal visitation rights. But I did not have to wait for a court date to see my grandson. Marcus brought him to me that same afternoon. I sat on my worn velvet sofa, the one Marissa had called trash, and held Leo in my arms for the first time. He was heavy, warm, and smelled like milk and innocence. He looked up at me with eyes that mirrored my son's, and I felt the last jagged edges of my heart smooth over. I was no longer a ghost in this family. I was his grandmother. The town, of course, had a field day. The local newspaper ran a feature with a headline that I framed "Mother Rejected, from Church Saves Son from Financial Ruin." I went from being the pariah of the parking lot to a local folk hero. Strangers stopped me in the grocery store to shake my hand. But I did not let the fame go to my head. I had work to do. Marcus moved back into his childhood bedroom, but I made one thing crystal clear. This was not a retreat. It was a rehabilitation. I told him he could stay, but there were conditions. He had to attend weekly therapy sessions to understand why he had allowed himself to be controlled. He had to get a job that he chose, not one Marissa picked for him. And he had to pay rent. It was nominal, just a few $100s a month. But it was about principle. I was his mother, not his crutch. I would support him, but I would never again enable the weakness that nearly cost us everything. I found my own purpose again. 2. I returned to Ridgeway Community Services, not just as a case manager, but as an advocate. I used my own story to help men and women who were trapped in financially abusive relationships. I taught them how to spot the red flags, how to hide their assets, and how to stand up when someone told them they were worthless. Marissa's trial was short. The evidence was overwhelming. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution that will take her the rest of her life to earn. She lost all parental rights. When the gavel banged down, Marcus did not look at her. He looked at Leo, who was sleeping soundly in his carrier. 3 months later, we returned to the First Methodist Church. The air was crisp, and the leaves were turning gold. It was the redo of the baptism. This time, there were no flashy cars blocking the street. There were no performative guests who did not know the baby's name. It was just family, true friends, and the community that had rallied around us. I walked down the aisle, not as an intruder, but as the guest of honor. People smiled as I passed. Reverend Miller gave me a nod of genuine respect. When the water touched Leo's forehead, he let out a small cry, and Marcus soothed him instantly. My son looked different. He looked tired, yes, but he looked solid. He was a father now, in every sense of the word. As we stood on the church steps afterward, blinking in the sunlight, Marcus turned to me. He shifted Leo to one arm and wrapped the other around my shoulders. He did not have to say anything. The gratitude was in his grip. I looked at the two of them, my past and my future, and I smiled. I finally spoke the words that had been brewing in my soul since that first terrible text message. I told him that finally he could see that I was not a distraction, but the foundation. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I know family drama can be heavy, but I hope this ending brought you some satisfaction. Drop a comment down below and let me know where you are tuning in from. I love seeing how far these stories travel and hearing your thoughts on how you would have handled a situation like this. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, smash that like button, and hit the hype button to help this video get recommended to more people. Your support means the world to me. Stay strong, everyone.